Shabbat Shalom. There is a short passage in the Talmud in Tractate Pesachim, which outlines 3 different types of people that, in blunt words, God is said to quote-unquote hate. The first is that of Hamedaber echad bapeh ve'echad balev, the one who says one thing with their mouth and means another with their heart. To speak of this is, of course, strong language, but in a sense, it's the power of language I want to look at this Shabbat, in light of the joint statement released earlier this week by the Prime Ministers of my 2 countries, Canada and Australia, together with the Prime Minister of New Zealand. To paraphrase the statement, here are some of the highlights which appear for all intents and purposes kosher. They unequivocally condemn Hamas's heinous attack on October 7th and the associated violence, including sexual violence. Check. They affirm Israel's right to exist and to defend herself in accordance with international law. Check. They are concerned with the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza and wished for increased and sustained aid. Check. They call for a ceasefire conditioned on the release of the remaining hostages. Check. They underscore that there is no role for Hamas in the future governance of Gaza, and that Hamas must stop using Gaza as a platform for terrorism and its people as human shields. Check. They condemn the settlements and the settler violence and see them as a hindrance to a 2-state solution. Check. They worry about the war spilling over on other borders, namely in Lebanon and Yemen. Check. They condemn the rise of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-Arab sentiment globally and commit themselves to combating prejudice and hatred everywhere. Check. This might be the reason, then, why it was so disappointing and even hurtful or shocking when, mere hours later, despite this statement, which appears again on the surface to be fair, even supportive of Israel, all 3 countries, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, all voted in favour of the United Nations resolution, which excluded each of these conditions, bar the release of the hostages, thank God, and simply called for a ceasefire. It feels plain and simply hypocritical, like saying one thing with your mouth and meaning another with your heart. Hypocritical because, according to CIJA, the resolution fails to hold Hamas accountable for their war crimes, which have been perpetrated against and affect both Palestinian and Israeli civilians. Hypocritical because it doesn't also ask Hamas to lay down their arms or to stop firing rockets at Israel. And hypocritical because in the list of countries that Canada consulted about this resolution, Israel was not among that list. In defending the decision, Canadian Foreign Minister Melanie Joy said that it was important how Israel defends itself, and this is true. We know this to be true too, because it is deeply rooted in our Jewish law to conduct ourselves justly and even compassionately in times of conflict. This is why our Torah in the book of Deuteronomy teaches us that offers of peace must first be extended, and only then may war be waged. It is why Israelite soldiers later in Deuteronomy are commanded that when they go out from their encampments, kitetze, against their enemies, they must protect themselves from evil in their behavior. It is even why Deuteronomy instructs that trees must not be destroyed during a siege, which is then extended nowadays to unnecessary destruction of property. It's why the book of Kings then counsels King Ahav that Israelite rulers were to be malchei chesed, merciful sovereigns. It's also why the ancient Midrash teaches that in a state of war, at least one side of the arena of battle must be left open to allow innocents to flee. In our context, in our current war, This may look like humanitarian assistance, which has steadily ramped up as Operation Iron Swords evolved, the creation of safe corridors and or safe zones, the dropping of leaflets warning residents when to evacuate and even sometimes where to evacuate. All of which the IDF have done as a fact, including earlier today opening the Kerem Shalom crossing from Israel to Gaza to allow additionally increased aid in to enter the beleaguered Strip. In other words, it's hypocritical because we can understand from our tradition that this dissonance between word and action has created uncertainty and confusion, as per a combined statement from the Zionist Federation of Australia and the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. It feels like those who have for a long time framed themselves as allies of Israel and allies of the Jews are saying one thing with their statement, but doing another with their vote. If Canada, or equally, on my end, Australia, did not totally agree with the language of the UN vote as they claimed, and as alluded to by Liberal MP Robert Oliphant, then if not voting against the resolution, we could have at least abstained to avoid this inconsistency. As the Australian Jewish statement put it, the government cannot have it both ways. Either it stands by its position in the joint statement that recognises that Hamas must be removed from power and return all the hostages, or it supports a ceasefire which would allow Hamas to remain in power and deliver on its promise to repeat the attacks of 7th of October at the earliest possible opportunity. Moreover, as illuminated in a letter written and delivered by the Reform Rabbis of Canada to the Prime Minister and Madame Jolie in recent days, such hypocrisy leaves the Jewish community feeling ever more alone at an already lonely moment. Relatedly, this was one of Siege's concerns too, that such an action or inaction, depending on your perspective, may add fuel to this fire of rising anti-Semitism. This, we know, we understand, and we empathise is a worry and stress of Jews all across Canada and indeed the world, including many of you good people in our congregation. Back to the Reform Rabbis of Canada, they write that, aside from the trauma and pain inflicted upon our Israeli siblings on October 7, at home we have never felt more alone. Our children are afraid to express their identity in public. The seniors of our community lament that the anti-Jewish hate they witness is comparable to the Holocaust. Universities have become hotbeds of radical propaganda targeting Jews. One by one, our friends have abandoned us, afraid to stand alongside our community in its time of need. The UN vote therefore felt like a pivot, one that tells Canada's Jewish population that support is conditional upon political expediency, and now I've ended the quote and I'm paraphrasing, and that we lack the same rights as every other people to protect and defend ourselves because of such a one-sided motion in which blame is cast solely upon Israel. This refrain from condemning Hamas outright is potentially equivalent to holding Israel solely responsible for the devastation on October 7. No wonder we feel as isolated and vulnerable as ever. Arts Canada, the Zionist voice of the Reformed Jewish community in Canada, in their own letter, co-authored by our Holy Blossom member, Jeff Denneberg, proposes several solutions to bring our hearts and our heads closer into alignment. They suggest that the Prime Minister joins his G7 colleagues in visiting Israel to show Canada's support for Israeli victims of Hamas terror. Canada could also be a leader in pursuing Hamas's head honchos in the International Criminal Court, particularly in relation to sexual crimes. We could also announce, like several of our allies, our discontinuation of funding to the UN RWA, whose employees in Gaza celebrated the massacre and who knowingly indoctrinate their children to hate Israel and to hate Jews. with these ideas in mind, we could take some practical, meaningful steps together in the right direction. Whilst much is yet to be determined, ultimately, I do believe that we share the same goal in our hearts, and that we can hope for better from our leadership as we work, God willing, towards a lasting, eventual, enduring peace. On that note, Canada and separately Australia have, in the words of the Arts Canada letter, a historical reputation for advancing liberal democracy as a strong contributor to the protection of free countries from aggression, as a global moral compass, and as a pioneer in peacekeeping. As the world watches, we await with bated breath. We can conclude with these words of blessing, this prayer for justice from our weekday Amidah, found in our Siddur Pirkei Kodesh on page 60. And it goes as follows. Hashiva shoftenu kvarishona, v'yoatzenu kvatchila, v'haser mimenu yagon va'anacha, umloch aleinu, ata Adonai levadcha bechesed uverachamim, v'tzadkenu b'mishpat, baruch ata Adonai, melech ohev tzedakah u'mishpat. Restore the justice sought by our judges and our counselors at the beginning. Remove from us sorrow and sighing, and may you alone reign over us, Adonai, with kindness and compassion. Make us righteous with justice. Praise to you, Adonai, sovereign, lover of righteousness and justice. Ken Yehi Ratzon and Shabbat Shalom.